Welcome to Free Kiwis. Today we're delighted to be joined by Professor Doug Elliffe. Now, Doug is a professor of psychology at the University of Auckland, and he is also a member of the Satanic Seven, otherwise known as the Listener Seven, the group of Auckland academics who signed a letter a few years ago now, criticising the idea that Mātauranga Māori or Māori law is science. And it's pretty well versed both in this podcast and elsewhere what happened as a result of that. But, welcome to the podcast, Doug. It's good to have you.
Thank you very much, Michael. Thank you, James. It's I've been a long admirer of your podcast that you've been doing and raising the issue of academic freedom, free speech, and institutional neutrality. Of course, I think these things are very important to the future of not only universities, but the future of the nation and indeed humanity. So
Indeed.
Happy to talk about those issues.
And we will. But first, I would like to hear about Caledonian crows.
Because New Caledonian crows.
I believe you've done a little bit of research on some of their behavioural characteristics.
Look, I have, but I don't want to take a whole lot of credit for that work because that's mainly Russell Gray's work. And I was brought into that research to act as a kind of wet blanket, to offer explanations for what looked like very complicated and interesting and cognitive and human-like behavior by these particular birds, to offer explanations of that based on simple learning principles and to help to suggest controls that could possibly rule those explanations out. So my job is, I think my job generally is to apply Occam's razor to all questions and to look for the simplest possible explanations, and if that will do, to stick with that explanation. But I also have this kind of romantic hope that every so often I'll be proved wrong and that we'll find that, yes, there is more going on than that. So I want the data to force there to be more going on than that. So we think that that we did find convincing demonstrations of, say, causal understanding by crows in the Aesop's fable stone dropping problem that couldn't be interpreted just in terms of simple learning principles. So that kind of thing.
So what's that? Can you unpack that for our listeners who won't have any knowledge of that? So what's this stone dropping problem? Did you say Aesop's fables?
So you obviously know about Aesop and Aesop's fables.
I know about that, yeah. I didn't know crows were reading it.
Right? So one of those fables was about an animal, and I can't actually remember what sort of animal it was in the original fable, being faced with a situation where there was food floating on the surface of some water down a tube, and the animal couldn't reach the food, but it could raise the level of the water by dropping stones into it and therefore lifting it up. Okay, so we found that was something that crows could learn to do very quickly, and without going into all of the details about the kind of null hypothesis, simple learning principles that might have understood, might have explained why they were doing that. We think we managed to rule those out, and therefore to say that the crows knew what they were doing.
Right. I actually observed something very similar when I was at Melbourne University some years ago, sitting in the quad eating lunch. And there was a rubbish bin with a polythene liner, a large rubbish bin. And there was obviously something tasty at the bottom of it. And a crow came and sat on the rim of the bin, which was lined with this polythene. And then it stuck its claw in and pulled up the polythene and jammed it down on the edge, and then went with the other claw and pulled that up. And it kept doing that until it could get the food, which it did very cleverly. And so, I mean, I guess the question that I'm gleaning, that the question that you were interested in is, is this explainable in kind of Skinnerian behaviorist terms? Is it just kind of a series of learned operations, or is there some higher cognition going on there? Is that the kind of...
That's absolutely the basic question. So my inclination is always to look for the simplest Skinnerian explanation, though I might segue just briefly about that shortly. But we really need, Sagan's balance applies. So extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. So I'm a kind of Bayesian, and if my prior estimate of the probability of something is relatively low, then I'm going to need a lot more evidence to believe it. And
Yeah.
yeah, so I mean, Bayes is, I think, a way almost to apply Occam's razor mathematically.
Right. Yes,
Yeah,
indeed. But you were able to rule out largely, or at least rigorously test the idea that it could be just
yeah, I
a
think
kind of
so.
behaviorist series of
Yeah,
conditioned responses, and in favor of some higher order reasoning in
yeah,
these birds.
I think so. And just by the way, because you're a cognitive psychologist, Michael, I'll just mention that what we've been saying about the role of reward now is that it doesn't do simple Skinnerian strengthening of the behavior that came before it. What it does is to signal future behavior that will be successful in the future,
Right.
so that we're moving to a somewhat more cognitive explanation of how it is that reinforcement works. And this, if you like, brings together Skinnerian conditioning with Pavlovian conditioning, whereas the understanding of Pavlovian conditioning has been for a long time that
Okay, so
organisms are trying to predict their likely future.
that's
And
really
we now
interesting.
think that's true for operant Skinnerian conditioning too. And this has been the main theme of my lab with Sarah Cowie, Michael Davison at Auckland. We've been working on this for a long time, and I think we're slowly beginning to convince people that we need to apply Occam's razor, yes, but not Occam's Swiss Army knife, as I sometimes like to put it, that we don't need special purpose explanations for all different situations. So parsimony in science is, of course, always a goal, but we can get obsessed about it. And if we can explain a whole variety of different, apparently conflicting data sets by adding one concept, then maybe that's actually quite a parsimonious thing to do. So predicting the future.
So what was the reward you were offering the crows?
Food.
Okay, so what you're saying is, so the classic Pavlovian model would be something like crow does a behavior and gets food, and therefore crow repeats behavior because it likes food, not because it's understanding anything about the situation. And you're trying to
Yeah,
move from that to saying, actually, when the crow repeats the behavior, it's thinking, in the future, I will get more food?
yeah. Maybe we're going further along this particular line than we want to for this interview. So first, that wouldn't be Pavlovian. It would be operant conditioning, Skinnerian conditioning. So that would be about the idea that a behavior that has been followed by reinforcement should be strengthened and therefore more likely to happen again. But we tried test situations where, say, the stones that could be dropped into the water would float rather than sink, and therefore they wouldn't work and things like that. So would they do that? And the answer could be, well, they've just learnt to drop sinking stones and not heavy stones, and they don't understand. But if that were true, then if you used the sinking stones versus the floating stones as discriminative stimuli in a search task or as conditioned reinforcers for something else, it ought to transfer to those, and it didn't. So it was quite specific about the particular task, which would suggest that they understood something about the nature of the task, the
Or
mechanics
something
involved.
about the physics of dropping stones in water.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
something about that.
Yeah,
Something
yeah.
about that.
I mean, it was
Yeah,
always a bit of a frustration to me with behaviorism, which I learned about at Monash University in the 1980s. There was,
you would have.
I think it was Jason White back then
Yeah,
in at Monash who taught us behaviorism. And what I found frustrating was Skinner's refusal to think about anything that happened inside, the black box, as they called it, which to me is where all the interesting stuff is. I mean, the
yeah.
stimulus and response, that's part of the story, but, what's happening inside is the really interesting stuff.
Of course, of course. Yeah. Though that said, if we can do explanations just in terms of the things we can see without needing to speculate, we should try. I think what Skinner came to say in the end, and I'm not actually particularly Skinnerian,
Mm.
was to say that the skin is no barrier, so that thinking is just another behaviour, and we can interpret that in the same way. The problem is that we can't actually get at it and we can't measure it
No, well,
directly. So
that I guess is where cognitive psychology came in the late
yeah,
1950s to start to fill in that box because it's,
yeah,
and then you want to connect that to the hardware or the wetware, as it were, the brain itself and what that's doing. So
You certainly need things to be biologically plausible, but where I do agree with Skinner, and I guess various other people have said this in different ways, that there will be different levels of explanation where we find the lawful relationships. Like we know that Newtonian mechanics is wrong, right? And it's actually quantum mechanics or relativistic effects or whatever is a, you know, I hope there's no physicists listening to that, whatever that might be. But if we're wanting to make predictions about the world that we live in that isn't moving at light speed, then we're
The
just
human
as
scale
well.
world. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
They
that's
do
right.
well enough.
And one of the things that we can predict about human behavior is a kind of penchant for outrage. And you certainly had a first-hand experience of that
Yeah.
when you signed that letter with the six others a few years ago. So tell us a little bit, Doug, about your motives for signing that letter and also your reaction to the reaction.
Yeah. That's a clever segue, and I have to say that I didn't predict the level of outrage that we got. So my motivations for signing that letter when I was asked to consider it by Mike Corbelis, my long-standing colleague and good friend, and probably the greatest New Zealand psychological researcher that there has been, I would say. So
I,
he asked me if I
I
would
think
like to
that's right.
consider signing this because it related to issues that we'd been talking about for a long time. And the thing that provided my tipping point, which made me say, okay, I will do this, is the suggestion that was in the NCEA curriculum that Maori students shouldn't study science because an instrument of the colonizer, and it was not for them and designed to oppress them. And I've had a long-standing interest in not just having more Maori students in science, but uh, um, I really dislike the idea that somebody's culture or their heritage should prevent them from doing something, that there should be something that is not for them.
It almost
So I
sounds a bit
wanted,
racist to suggest that science isn't for Maori students, doesn't it?
well, yeah, in my conception of what racism is, that would be true. Other people have conceptions that of how you might define racism that say that you have to have a power imbalance there as well as simply discriminating on the basis of of people's ethnic origins. Um, yeah, so I wanted to kind of to counter that message and effectively to say to young Maori students, and I've had several. One of my best PhD students came from the Cook Islands and was Maori, and to say, look, you're welcome. Come and be part of this great scientific, world human enterprise. This is, about finding out more and more about the world. You're not limited by who you are, and that there's an awful lot of good stuff in it. And it's great fun. Richard Feynman wrote about the pleasures of finding things out, and I want everybody to experience that. So there was that, and one of the things that kind of justified me in that was one of the first emails I got after the listener letter was published was from someone who identified themselves as a female solo mum, Maori civil servant working in Wellington. And what she said in her email to me, and possibly the others got it too, was to say, look, we can't talk about any of this kind of thing at work. It would just be, frowned on and we'd be seen as evil for raising it. But thank you for trying to save my kids' education. And I
Right.
say, well, yep, that's what I was trying to do. And at the same time, I thought, so at the time I was acting Dean of Science. I'd been Deputy Dean of Science for some years before that. And thought that one of the things that I think you should do when you're leading a faculty is you're not just a manager, you're not just doing HR, that you should have some kind of passion for the discipline that your faculty represents. And in my case, what that was scientific thinking. And I wanted to say, look, there are some good things about it, and here we are. Science is, I think, the best way of trying to understand the world that humanity has yet come up with. It's not to say that there might not be better ones. We've had some very bad ones, and that science is, I think, good at rejecting bad ideas and replacing them with better ideas. So that it's a kind of fast fail system, which is kind of how I like to run management. So let lots of flowers bloom, but cut down the ones that aren't working quickly and replace them with better ones. So we called it In Defense of Science because science was being attacked, and also to say, look, really, there's a bunch of good stuff here about science. It is for everybody. One of the great things is how it's open to challenge, and it doesn't matter who you are, you can still do it. So welcome in. Those are my reasons for signing it.
All right, so maybe talk a little bit about the reaction, because there will be people listening to this podcast who don't know much about the listener letter. So what happened after you published this letter? I'll just do a little bit of summary. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. This letter said that ultimately it said that Matarangamari is not science. However, it said lots of respectful things about Matarangamari. It plays a key role in management and policy, something like that. It was very respectfully written, and it went out there. What was the response?
Yeah, we thought so. So I'll just mention that we didn't mention Matarangamari at all. What we talked about was Indigenous knowledge in a general sense, and one of the points that I believe, although my friend Kendall Clements thinks he did it, was to put in something saying that as a way to discover universal empirical knowledge, effectively science is unmatched. And my argument for that, which I think is unanswerable, is that Indigenous knowledges, there are many of them all over the world, Indigenous belief systems, we might call them, draw their kind of moral force from coming from a particular people in a particular place. That's why we call them Indigenous. And they are different from each other, of course. So therefore, when we're trying to find out universal truths, they make no claim to be universal. And so therefore, I would have thought it was just quite uncontentious for us to say that. But so one of the first things I learned is that you will be misquoted and you'll be misrepresented and you'll be criticised by people who haven't read what you've said. So we are always portrayed as having said Indigenous knowledge is not as good as science. It falls far short of science. But what we said was that, yep, it falls far short in this particular way, in the search for universal truth. So there was that. Yeah. So I hate to sound pedantic, but I do want even to a sympathetic audience, to represent what it is that we actually did say.
And I think that's really important. And also, setting aside careless and malicious responses, of which there were plenty, it seems to me that one of the issues is that most people don't actually understand what science is.
Yeah.
And so when you make a claim like that, unless they've, read Karl Popper or other philosophers of science, they don't really understand what you're talking about. And I guess if I had a criticism of the listener 7, it would be probably you should have written something longer somewhere else, because you really need to lay out the issues so that to avoid that kind of misunderstanding. And I think you've raised one of the things there, which is that Indigenous knowledge tends to focus on the very local and what's true for this particular people in this area, whereas science is pushing towards universal explanations of the natural world. It seems to me another one is that science grew out of a culture in which the sacred and the secular had been to a degree separated, and that enabled people to test all kinds of ideas without fear of the Inquisition, for one thing, and also within their own minds the separation of, or at least the principle that you could question all ideas, even those that some people held to be sacred, that there were no sacred ideas, and that everything is up for debate and bringing evidence to bear.
Yeah, so there's a lot to respond to there. The first thing is, yes, I think you're right. Trying to do this within 350 words was not easy, and of course there were bits we needed to take out. I think that the public generally thinks of science as a body of knowledge, and I think that that's a little bit true, but I think that mainly it's a method of inquiry. It's a way of testing. It makes the assumption that some objective reality exists, and that you can test various explanations of that objective reality, and that's what you should be doing all of the time. You're right that so I think that while there were things well before the Enlightenment that you could describe as almost proto-science or something like that, I think it's true that this separation of the the sacred from the secular began there and was necessary for science. That's not to say that there aren't many practicing scientists who have strong spiritual beliefs of various kinds.
Right.
I don't myself. I find that that's, although having been raised that way and being Christian for many years, I have become an almost evangelical atheist now. But I perfectly accept that there are people who can rely on spirituality, if you like, for their moral principles, and nevertheless rely on scientific inquiry for their understanding of the world. How that fits in with accounts of the origin of the world, of creation and things, is something that I can't do myself, but I can understand that people can. So yes, you're right. We did think so. There had certainly been pressure within my own university. I wouldn't say this was university policy, but a notion that Mataranga Maori should be regarded as protected knowledge, as a taonga, and therefore not open to be criticised. And I do react to that because I think that scientific conclusions that have survived challenge are the ones that we have much more faith in. It is not insulting, mana diminishing to criticize somebody's theory. It's in fact showing respect that you think it's worthy of engaging with, rather than just saying, "Oh, don't be so silly."
Yeah.
So yeah, so that was I think part of it. I do think New Zealand universities, like New Zealand schools, really should be secular institutions. That's what the Education and Training Act, I believe, still says, and I don't think that part of it has been rescinded. So I do think that bringing spiritual explanations into science is not a good thing to do. That one of the things that we need to do is to recognise that most of the explanations people have had for natural phenomena over the millennia that humans have been around have been spiritual, and I can think of all sorts of good reasons why that might be, but that we have, I think, largely replaced those with better explanations, and it's been science that has enabled us to do that. And one of the good things about non-spiritual explanations, of course, is that they're testable, that you can make some attempt to find out whether they are in fact true or not.
Let's go back to the situation that unfolded.
Response.
Yeah, the response to the listener letter, because there are some things that happened to you. I mean, you've already mentioned that you were the dean or the deputy dean of science and you had to step down. Can you talk more about that?
Yeah, I can. First, there were reactions that all of us got. So the publication of an open letter promulgated by Sean Hendy and Susie Wiles, which lots of people signed on to. I could perhaps say more about that later.
Mm.
But the things that happened specifically to me, so some people, some of the I'm trying not to name or identify people because I don't think that would be fair. But there were people who reported to me who said essentially, "We don't mind the others saying this, that's all fine, that's their academic freedom, but you're in a leadership position and therefore you can't do that." Right. So there was that.
That's very interesting. Can I just pause there? That's very interesting, right? Because these people are acting as if in order to hold the leadership position at the University of Auckland at the moment, you can't take the view that indigenous knowledge is not science, right? That's what they're saying.
You can't articulate it publicly, at
You
least.
can't articulate that publicly. That would be their contention. And I think that if I had signed the listener letter as Dean of Science, they had something of a case, because that could be seen, therefore, as taking an institutional position.
Oh, I see.
And I think that there is a fine line there, and it's a difficult thing to do, but we can talk about lots of other violations of what I would consider to be the good principle of institutional neutrality later on, and how those are not applied. So I came under some pressure to resign. One of these people gave me what was effectively an ultimatum that if you don't resign within 24 hours, I'm going to provoke a governance crisis within the faculty. So I won't tell you exactly how that was being done because I don't think that would be fair. So I, of course, just discussed this with the permanent dean of science. The only reason I was acting dean was that the permanent dean had been seconded to a higher role for a while, and I stepped in, and other members of senior university leadership. And I think what we all thought was, I think there was a kind of a subtext, which is to say, let's try and hope this will all blow over one way or another. That is, that I don't think we thought at that stage that the threat to academic freedom that I now believe exists did exist then. So I think we were, if anything, somewhat naive. So rather than have this governance crisis, which would have essentially been a sort of a faction fight within the faculty, which I could have kind of led a faction in that against other people. And I thought, this is my university. I want things to go smoothly. And if the easiest way to make things go smoothly and to let us clean our own house internally and try and fix things is that if I step aside, okay, I'll do that. So I do need to emphasize that I didn't come under pressure from the university leadership to resign.
You made the decision
I made the decision
for the good
myself.
of the faculty.
That said, in an ideal world, I would have quite liked to be told, look, Duck, we support your right to say what you said. There is something in it, and we're going to defend you, and we'd like you to stay. I think that would have been nice.
Yep.
It didn't happen, and that may have been because people simply didn't agree with me. But it may also have been because they thought that this was the easiest way out of a potential crisis situation.
I'm sure the latter has a lot in it. But, with hindsight, so. Having learned more about the genuine crisis that faces academic freedom in not just New Zealand universities, but certainly around the Anglosphere and probably beyond. Would you think differently now about that decision and think, actually, I need to take a stand here and lead that faction? And yes, it'll be messy, but if we don't have the fight, then it's just going to carry on the way it is. Would you make a different decision if you knew what the real climate was like?
I think I might. I've asked myself that quite often, and I guess as a bit of context for that. So let me just mention two more things that happened to me because they sort of bear on that. So one of those things was that a lot of posters appeared almost the next day around the School of Psychology sort of premises, condemning me and Mike Corbliss, I believe, as being racist. I haven't seen these myself because the person who alerted me to them, I just asked her, look, could you just take them down? I don't need to see them. I was feeling, pretty bruised and so forth by then. So she did that. So there was that. The other thing is that there was, again, specifically directed at me and Mike Corbliss, there was a letter published from the president of the New Zealand Psychological Association, which my personal view is it was kind of unhinged and accusing us of racist tropes and white savior syndrome and all sorts of things. Now that's fine, and this person's perfectly entitled to say that. But what I did object to was the then head of the School of Psychology circulating that to all staff with a kind of approving note saying, "Good to see this published." And I thought, that is somebody in a line management position effectively attacking their own staff, which is, I think, something that you don't do that, and it was that I guess led me to think about institutional neutrality particularly. So there were those things. So one of the questions was, we got public condemnation and private support. So I lost count of the number of colleagues even who would approach me on the street or come to my office sort of secretly, making sure nobody had seen them arrive, and saying, look, good on you. We're really glad you did this. Is there anything we can do to help? And I would, when I was feeling bolshy, start saying things like, well, yeah, say the same things, be publicly
Exactly.
support.
Yeah.
That would be wonderful if there are lots of us. They can't sack the whole lot of us, can they? And of course, they didn't do that. And I really understand, because some of these people are quite junior in career terms. I'm not. I'm 64. Well, I was 60 then, so that I was then not thinking I'm as close to retirement as I think I might be now. But you know about this yourself, Michael.
That's a very
Of course,
interesting
James.
point. Can I just raise that point as well? I just want to highlight it for our listeners. So it sounds like there are lots of people at New Zealand universities, including you, who think that people are actually at risk of their jobs being taken away if they support a particular intellectual position.
I think they are. I think it's more subtle. I think that there is a risk of your job being taken away, but I think that that's unusual. There is a risk of lack of preferment. I've certainly found this myself, that there's a risk of, when you put yourself forward for policy committees and things, just being automatically rejected. I believe that that's happened to me. And I think that there is a risk of, there's a kind of self-censorship which is caused by what you could call social disapproval.
Yeah.
And I don't like the fact that this is so, but I think that there's a we could call it sinistro-normativity. That is an assumption that everybody is on the left side of politics, and that, and that you just must be.
And it's an almost justified assumption if we look at the data on,
look,
academics' political beliefs, but
it is. Yeah.
But it drives at the heart of the academic freedom issue to me, because even if that's true, there's no reason why left-wing people can't support academic freedom. And so they could think, well, okay, most people are on the left, and sometimes I make that assumption, but if somebody turns out to be on the right, that's fine, and we'll have an argument, and that'll be good.
Yeah, and I think that they would that many would contend that they do. So the TEU, comes out strongly saying we support academic freedom. Have to say that their actions in writing a letter to us that was strongly critical. They said, you are entitled to exercise your academic freedom, but you've hurt a whole lot of people, so therefore you shouldn't have done it. Effectively.
Yeah, I remember that letter well.
Well, yeah. It's a position. It's a position you could take. I don't think that academic freedom versus not should be a left-right divide. And in fact, if you think about it historically, there has been much more threat to academic freedom coming from the right, and the people who were radical reformers were the ones who wanted academic freedom. My opinion is that they now have that. You can say almost anything you like if you're coming from that side of the political spectrum. But I think that censorship is pretty much unidirectional now, and evidence for that would be the number of really quite radical proposals around indigenising universities, say, that get published, approvingly. I do want to come back to just to something you asked at the very beginning, Michael. You said that your one criticism was that we should have tried for a longer publication in some other form where we could explain things better. Don't think that we didn't, okay? So I think I wasn't involved at this stage, but there were certainly attempts to submit things making longer arguments and in much more detail to various journals within New Zealand, the Journal of the Royal Society in particular, and these were all rejected.
Right.
So when censorship, I think, of course, everything that you submit to academic journal should be subject to peer review. And I've no difficulty with that. But I think that in these cases, some of the basis of the peer review was just that they objected to the premises, which I think is a difficult thing to do. So we did try, and so I think that at that point, going public was really the only choice. And I'd also say that I think we live in, at least in principle, a liberal democracy, and that ultimately the public should be the ruler of what happens in the country. That's how democracy is supposed to work. And
Yeah.
so therefore, try to persuade the public that this is your view on something is, I think, not an unreasonable thing to do as a kind of fulfilling the critic and conscience role of society that academics are supposed to have.
I think there's a risk of placing an unfair burden on people who want to make that side of the argument, who want to represent that side of the argument, that like they or we always have to write these extremely nuanced, long things.
Yeah,
And the other side, which is orthodoxy in the academy, they can write whatever they want. They can write tweets, which are actually kind of highly offensive and insulting, and they get away
yeah,
with all that. And no one says, oh, you should have been more nuanced. So I think that, yeah, you're allowed to have that view in full article form. You're allowed to put that view in the form of a letter. You're allowed to put that put that argument in the form of a tweet. I think all those things are fine.
yep,
But I wanted to come back again though to this position you held as acting dean, because I wanted you to talk a little bit more about that, because I think for a lot of people, I heard someone say something like, oh yeah, that guy didn't really lose his job. It was just an administrative position. So there's nothing to see here. That wasn't a real threat to academic freedom. How did
yeah.
that affect you personally? Did you sort of just think, it's not taking up much of my time anyway, or maybe like it's taking up too much of my time anyway. I don't really care about the position. Wasn't a big deal. Is that how you felt about it?
No, well, without going into sort of university remuneration structures and in too much detail, in in the second half of my career, so I guess in about 2010, I became head of psychology, and I had to be dragged kicking and screaming to do this. But then found that it was something that I think I both had a sort of an aptitude for, and was kind of doing a useful job. So I saw my main role in that being to try to help my colleagues succeed in as many different ways as it was, as they could reasonably do that, and again, let 100 flowers bloom, and just try to see what happens. So I supported lots of different things, and then when I finished doing that, because you serve a term, you do, or at least I did, reach the stage where you think, I used to like being able to try to influence policy at a higher level, and to try to lead my institution. I came to Auckland in 1979 as an optometry student, and I've always been kind of proud of the place, and I think universities are good things, and I want them to succeed, and therefore, I like to try to influence the way things go. So I did think that I would spend the last part of my career less on my own research and more on, trying to help run the institution. And by running the institution, I just mean managing it, keeping it all going smoothly, but try to influence aspects of its path, and to try and make us better. So at that level, I really disliked feeling that I needed to step down from doing that. And in the financial sense, the bonus payment, if you like, that you get for being a dean is pretty substantial, and there's also one for being deputy dean, which is not nearly so substantial, but is worthwhile. Because of stepping down as acting dean, couldn't really go back to the deputy dean position, so I didn't do that. I would have thought that I would have been doing that quite possibly still now. So this cost me, in financial terms, about a couple of $100,000. So I wasn't sacked as a professor, but my influence was reduced, and my income was certainly reduced.
So it was a major demotion, not only a major demotion, but it sounds like you were sort of on the administrative track, and this, for a variety of reasons, kind of knocked you off that administrative path completely, and you didn't feel welcome to kind of re-engage on that level with the university.
Yeah, well, I do nevertheless, because I know a lot of people now, and I try to influence them privately, but I don't do that from any sort of official role anymore.
Right, and for other people like younger academics looking at what happened to you, I suspect the signal that was sent by that was very much, we better not even talk about the relationship between science and indigenous knowledge, because
Yeah.
if we have any interest in climbing that administrative hierarchy.
we better not talk about anything that we think could conceivably conflict with university policy or conceivably conflict with the zeitgeist. Yeah, and I don't think that that's what universities should be like. So for some time, I tried to encourage them not to think like that, and I guess tried to. I mean, I'm doing it now, but tried to downplay some of what happened to me because I wanted to encourage my colleagues, particularly my younger colleagues, to continue being brave. And I'm still hopeful for universities, but I think that we need to seize the nettle on matters of academic freedom and institutional neutrality and simply drive these a lot harder.
Yeah, I'm pleased that you're telling us about the personal costs,
Yeah.
because it's important that people know that and it is part of the picture. Of course, you don't want that to be a kind of cautionary tale to young people to keep their mouths shut.
I
But
really don't.
but
Yeah.
on the other side of it, you want, I guess, the public to know and politicians to know, and other
Well,
people in the university who may not know just how bad it can be, and how the the kind of ideological capture of the university is stifling its purpose.
That's the thing. I mean, I think that's
Yeah,
why it's a
it's
difficult thing
there.
for those of
It's
us
reality.
yeah,
Yeah.
those of
yeah,
us who've been driven out of the academy. I mean, it's difficult to explain even to sort of family and friends what's
yeah,
happened. I think people tend to assume, oh, the universities are fine, all that stuff about academic freedom, that's just kind of a right-wing trope. And
well,
actually, there's lots of evidence that this is going on. And I think if
mm,
people don't speak out, it
yeah,
makes it harder for the rest of us to actually tell people there's something going on at the universities. No, it's not,
yeah,
it's not that you go to university and everything is 24/7, just complete madness and rioting and stuff like that. There's a lot of good work that is still done there, but there's a lot of teaching and research, which is pretty much normal. But, if you sort of go anywhere near some of these, really controversial issues like Indigenous knowledge and science, your career could be severely damaged.
yep. I think that's true, and that so you're right. There is this kind of tension between saying, look, bad stuff happened to me, and therefore, and I don't want to paint myself as a martyr.
No, you're not doing that at all, Doug.
Um, um, I've, I've had a good career. It would be not too far from its end anyway. I'm 64. I'm proud of what I've done, but I'm less proud of the institution I work in than I used to be, and I find that personally very saddening. I don't think it's beyond saving. I don't think that other universities are beyond saving too.
Well, so
Um,
it's probably a
yeah,
good time to turn to that question. And I'd preface that by saying that, of course, you suffered personal harm, and so did many of your
yeah,
co-signatories. I mean, Professors Nola and Corbelis and Cooper were put under investigation by the Royal Society. Michael
yeah,
Corbelis died before they were exonerated. Um,
yeah.
I mean, Professor Elizabeth Rata. I mean, she's a tough lady. She's been fighting these kinds of battles for decades, and she seems to have a pretty thick skin. But I'm sure that at some level it has a personal effect. And Professor Kendall Clements also, had some real problems with being removed from first year teaching and so on in the aftermath of all of this. So it's had a personal cost for you all. But then on the upside, I would say it was a galvanizing moment. I think,
Well,
you brought together a community, what's become, I would say, a community of scholars, both inside the university and outside the university, who now do see the problem quite clearly and who have
yeah,
started to formulate a response to it. And
yeah.
I think that it's not far short of the mark to say that what's now before Parliament in terms of the legislation to uphold academic freedom owes a debt to the Listener 7 and to the group of people who coalesced around them in its aftermath.
Thank you, Michael. I think that's, yeah, well, I do think that without wanting to sound self-aggrandizing, I think that that's true. So one of the questions that was being asked at a recent Free Speech Union session on on institutional neutrality in particular, but academic freedom in a broader sense, was suppose the listener letter episode happened today. Do you think something different would happen? Do you think that things would be handled differently? And the general conclusion was, I think it would. I think that university leadership has become more aware that there is not just one side to this, and that you know they do need to consider matters of academic freedom and particularly institutional neutrality more than they had thought that they needed to in the past. So I think that's true. Whether it would have happened without the prompt caused by the listener letter is, I think, a second question, and I think probably not. I think probably this did do something to change things, and it's true that there is a kind of an informal group that's coalesced around the surviving members, and I'm very grateful for that. But one of the things that one of the points I want to make about that is that we, among ourselves, discuss all sorts of things, and we have different views, and we argue them quite, vigorously. Matters to do with Israel and Palestine and Gaza and things like that. And to me, that's the model, or the value or otherwise of President Trump. And when I first came to university. When I first became a staff member at university, my neighbours on one side were a pure mathematician and the other one was a Latin American historian. And that's what we used to do. We used to debate things and we had different views. But we began, and this is one of the things I tried to say in my resignation letter as dean, but was advised to take out. Look, what about if we take a position of assuming goodwill, that if you disagree with somebody, that doesn't mean that that person is evil, and there might be other things where you would agree with them. And I get it, and so this sort of civil disagreement is, I think, the essence of what a university is. But of course, if you have the view that the purpose of a university is not a truth-seeking institution, and in my view, that's what universities should be doing, is the discovery, improvement, and dissemination of knowledge. That's what they should be about. But there is an alternative perspective, which kind of began in the Soviet Union, I think, which is that they are apparatuses for social engineering. They are trying to produce a different society by doing these. Now, if you think that, then you really don't want disagreement, because the disagreement interferes with your agenda. Therefore, you want to drive that forward. So that this notion of a community of people who, respect each other on the human level, are prepared to listen to what each other says, accepting that they might violently, no, not violently perhaps, but strongly disagree on some matters, is, I think, something that's kind of antithetical to this social engineering project.
Yeah.
And so maybe I'm just old-fashioned. I tend to like the notions of courtesy, and that we ought to be able to interact with each other in a sort of a gentlemanly way, if you like. One of the things that I'll just while I'm on this sort of mawkish trend, just mention slightly. One of the things that upset me most was being attacked by people who I'd done a considerable amount to help during their careers, and I would have thought, in my dark nights of the soul, I was thinking, didn't I build up any credit, to say this is a decent person whose ideas, that I'm going to make the assumption that he is not malicious, that he is not racist, that he is not, trying to.
You're assuming that they're thinking sort of logically and fairly, and I don't think that's always the case.
No, well, I think that's right. So one of the other things that came up at the Free Speech Union session was effectively, what do we do about disagreement? And there seemed to be a general sense, particularly from the people who were running the meeting, that this can all be resolved among people of goodwill if we accept principles like evidence and reason and rational discussion and things like that. It'll be all right. There's no reason why you can't talk across ideological divides. And I would like to think that's true, but I don't think it is. That I think that there is a group, I think it's a small group, but disproportionately influential, who explicitly reject Enlightenment principles, and you know, and therefore you almost have no common frame of reference for talking, and that I think is problematic.
Yeah, I think another thing that makes it more difficult is this really strong view that power relations are the way the world is right now is partly about discourse. And so if you say something, that's not just an idea being put forward, it's also a kind of intervention in the discourse, the shape of the discourse. And so it
Potentially an
can
act of
actually
literal violence.
potentially enact literal violence, right? It can actually cause harm to people, right? So when you come out and say, actually, maybe Maturanga Maori or maybe indigenous knowledge isn't exactly the same as science, you know, the old classical liberal way of looking at that, or the old scientific way of looking at that would have been, oh, that's a hypothesis.
Hmm.
We can test that. No one's been harmed. You know, we can all discuss that as grown-ups. Another way of looking at it is this is part of a system of discourse that's oppressing indigenous people. And by saying that, by even advancing that idea, you're adding to that and you're harming people directly. And I think that idea is alarmingly common in certain segments of academia at the moment.
Yeah. So I think I would, of course, I work within a science faculty, and I would say that it is. I don't think it's common, but I think it's influential disproportionately to to its numbers.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
And I mean, it doesn't take very many loud bullies to make everybody feel
Yeah.
intimidated.
Yeah. Yeah. Well,
And I think they've really got a hold.
mm,
But to me, I mean, there were kind of a few things that have been going through my mind listening to you there, Doug. And one is, thinking back to my days, especially at Melbourne University and
mm,
La Trobe University in Melbourne and Monash, where I was trained as an honours student and did a couple of years as a research assistant. How the culture then was, I mean, it was so intellectually robust, it was scary. Like, you could be in a seminar and it was,
yeah.
I mean, we of course don't agree. Well, I don't agree that words can be literally violence, but it was pretty rough. But it wasn't as if anyone took it personally. There was no sense in
Yeah.
which anybody was, kind of thought they were being harmed. In fact, it was kind of almost a way in which friendships were reinforced to have a big intellectual argument about something. I would say it acted as a social glue, and I think that's because everybody understood that there was a mission above all of everybody's individual perspectives and their takes on the evidence and their theoretical views and all of that, which was to advance knowledge. And they
Yep.
understood that by duking it out in this kind of way, that's what they were doing. And so it was kind of fun. It was like, and when I was first an honours student and I witnessed the bear pit, as they called the Friday afternoon seminar at Monash, I was scared as hell. But it's a bit like a neophyte getting in the boxing ring. But
Yep.
after you've been through it a few times, you start to enjoy it, and then it does become this thing that is a lovely culture to be part of. And I just lament that young people have lost that opportunity largely.
Debating, I guess. Yeah. So
Yeah,
yes.
it's more than debating though, because
Yeah.
with debating, it's kind of it's literally like a game where you don't necessarily agree with the argument you're promulgating because you're on the team that's supposed to argue X instead of not X.
Oh,
But
sure.
but
Mm.
in science, we're giving our genuine views based on hard thinking, based on our research, based on our evaluation of evidence and other people's research, and trying with all our might to make the ideas better.
Yeah. So of course I agree with that, and that is a good way to make ideas better. But let me turn that around. So what we're sometimes being told by the proponents of different knowledge systems is, well, that's what we're wanting to do. Let's have all these ideas contributing, and say, okay, and therefore that will eventually forge something better in the end. And there was a paper written by the former Prime Minister's chief science advisor, which I think was advocating that sort of approach. And I would say, yes, fair enough, but it's very difficult to do this with the handcuffs on, as you
Well,
say.
exactly. Yeah.
If all of the time you are considering, being required to consider whether you will hurt somebody's feelings, whether you'll damage their mana by criticizing their ideas, whether you're only doing this to support your own privilege, it becomes very difficult to have the conversations at all. And I think so. I've heard the argument expressed, and I've checked this with other Maori to see whether they also believe this to be true, that in Te Ao Maori, there's no separation between playing the man and playing the ball, like we used to believe that if you attack my ideas, you are attacking my mana. And you say, okay, well, first, I've had that denied by other Maori to say, no, we don't think that at all.
Well, I hear that debate on marae can be pretty robust.
Absolutely, absolutely, and it is, I think, sorry, just to finish the point about that, but also to say, well, what a magnificent trump card, to have, that I can refuse to let you argue with me, because that will damage my identity if you do. And I think that if that premise is sort of accepted, we really might as well give up.
I
And
agree.
think that
We don't
intellectual
afford that privilege
institutions
to a lot of
can't
groups,
exist.
right? Like we've
Sorry?
long stopped affording that privilege to Christians, for example, right?
Well, yes,
So
you
if
have.
if
Yeah.
we wanted to just sort of take a softly approach and never hurt anyone's feelings, we wouldn't be teaching evolutionary biology, right? Because there's probably a good amount of Christians, also Christians from like the Pacific and whatever,
Yep.
not just sort of rich, wealthy white Christians, but Christians from all over the world who probably find that quite disturbing.
Yep.
But we rightly sort of override that in the interest of science and discussion. Of course, those people should have the ability to ask questions, and maybe they can have a Christian society where they debate these issues or whatever. But we go on with the evolutionary biology class, just
Yep.
as we should probably go on with classes about scientific methodology and how it's different to traditional knowledge.
And I would say that those Christians who believe that the world was created however many thousand years ago, and that God put all the species on Earth in 7 days, or however many days it took him to create the animals and so on, they're welcome to bring that idea to the table, but they have to then be prepared for it to be tested. Because this goes
Yeah.
back to our reflections at the beginning of the conversation that we can't have sacred ideas in science. And if you say, "Oh, you're attacking my mana by criticizing my ideas," you're effectively declaring your ideas sacred. So,
Yes, you are.
so
Yeah.
that by all means bring your hypotheses to the table, no matter what they are. And because we know, as good scientists, that sometimes outlandish sounding ideas turn out to have a lot of currency to them. And so we shouldn't reject them out of hand, but they must be subjected to evidence and debate.
Right. So I agree with that in a general sense, but it can lead to difficulties. And so in America, say this is played out in the demand for equal time, to teach intelligent design as well as evolution, say. And
Right,
so
but teaching's different, right? We
yeah,
we teach knowledge in science that has been tested and stood up to testing for a while. We don't, unless we're talking about postgraduate classes where we might, put out some pretty, raw ideas. But
yeah.
normally with undergraduates, you stick to the stuff that's really been, tested pretty well.
Well, yes, though I also think if you're doing it right, then you're always going on about how do we find this? Okay, so I gave a lecture quite recently about why you get a pause after reinforcement on fixed interval schedules. So that is saying, once you've just got a reward, a pigeon pecking a key, this is James, and you've just got some food, they tend to pause for a bit. Why is that? So stage one class, come up with hypotheses, and somebody always says probably because they're consuming the food. Okay, and so well, all right. Well, if that were true, and you could
We'd
do
get it
this
with the
in your
random
class.
reward schedule then as well, wouldn't we?
Absolutely, yes. So that is your comparison. So if they were randomly spaced in time, then you should still get the pauses. If that's the explanation, you don't. So there must be another explanation. So the explanation must be that they have learnt that another reward won't be available for a while. And so I think so much of what you do isn't just about should be, isn't so much about teaching a set of facts, but getting the students to understand the notion of conducting experiments to separate between different explanations, and they can do this, and that's what makes it fun. this is where I'm a little concerned that I agree that student-centered learning has gone far too far, and I'm not suggesting that kids should always be coming up with their own hypotheses and trying to look into the questions that they're interested in. They need some subject knowledge, but I think that you can teach that in a way that talks about how the scientists who came up with this came up with it,
Oh,
and how
certainly.
so
Yeah.
scientific thinking is, I think, much more critical than scientific fact in what we teach.
Agree. But as you alluded, to get to the thinking, we do need some fact
Yeah,
to
absolutely. But you can scaffold these things together as you move up. Yeah,
yeah.
and yeah, yeah.
Okay. We've just gone past an hour, so we're going to have to sort of call it a day at this point. But I was just wondering, Doug, did you have anything else you wanted to say?
I guess so part of it is just as democracy is the worst system apart from all the other ones, and that what democracy provides is a way to throw out tyrants without war, right? Without conflict. That's what it's for. Democracy is different from science, so the truth of a scientific idea doesn't depend on how many people believe it. It depends on whether it accords with objective reality or not. So they are different in that sense, and trying to identify them with the same thing is always problematic. But they do share this in that they both provide mechanisms for throwing out bad ideas and for going along with good ideas. So that I think just as we should be teaching about the principles of liberal democracy and not giving up on them, we should also be teaching about the principles of scientific thinking and not giving up on that. And I think that we simply shouldn't allow trump cards on the basis of identity to be played, that these shouldn't count. That to me, the future of humanity is about recognizing the things that we have in common, and that there is much more that unites us than divides us, or should be. I don't think it's a left-right divide, but I think that there is a kind of totalitarian liberal divide, which is around at the moment, which is effectively saying, because I think this thing, everybody else must. And there are a variety of rhetorical tactics that have been used to try to push that view harder than I think most of the general public, if they just sort of stood back a bit and said, think about that, think about what it is you're saying, that they'd say, I don't like this. I think universities are risking going down this track. One of the things that universities depend on is institutional autonomy, that we should be able to run our own business. But the thing that underpins why society should give us that institutional autonomy, because it's a favour, right, is a kind of a social license, that we have to be doing something that society considers to be worthwhile. And I think that we are, I don't think I'm alone as a representative of the general public in thinking that we have gone down an arcane intellectual path that risks us losing that social license.
Mm.
We saw that in Marsden funding being removed from the social science and humanities panels, which I think that is a sad thing to have happened, but it's an inevitable consequence, I think, of crazy ideas being funded. I'm a Bayesian. Let's start with sensible priors about what it is that we're going to test, and that it was inevitable that people would react to say, look, you are no longer doing things that we are interested in. You're frittering stuff away, and we're going to stop you doing it. I think we risk that happening to universities as a whole if we don't reconnect ourselves again with this disinterested, objective drive to produce, improve, and disseminate knowledge. That's what we're for, and I think we're in danger of forgetting it.
So rather than complaining about the legislation to uphold academic freedom violating institutional autonomy, our universities ought to be embracing it as a means of restoring faith in the faith in them required for that social license.
I think so. Yeah, I mean, I think that it's true, because I've talked to them, that some politicians' interest in in academic freedom began with the listener letter. So I think that
Yeah.
we had an effect at that level there. And these people, like it or not, they are the leaders of the country. They represent, in a sense, the social license that we need to operate. We need to listen.
I agree, and I'm very grateful to you, Doug. We're very grateful to you for coming on the show today, and also for the contribution that you have personally made, and the price you've personally paid to bring these issues to light and to try to make a difference for the good of young people and the future of the country. So, thank you.
Michael, thank you very much, James, too. And I want to just sort of add my gratitude first for letting me talk a bit, but also for bringing issues like this to the attention of the wider public. I hope Free Kiwis listenership continues to grow, because I think it's important.
Thanks a
Thank
lot.
you.